Walk through any grocery store and you'll see the same thing. People spending huge amounts of money on food that disappears almost immediately. A bag of snacks, a frozen meal, a few drinks, a couple of convenience items. The cart looks full, the receipt is painful, and somehow a few days later, they're back at the store doing it all over again. What's interesting is that some of the cheapest foods in the store often provide the most value, not because they're exciting, because they work. They stay useful. They stretch meals. They keep people full. And almost every time food becomes harder to replace, people look back and say the same thing. I should have bought more of that. Let's start with one of the biggest examples. Rice. Rice isn't flashy. Nobody posts photos of their giant bag of rice online. Nobody brags about it. But when people start thinking practically, rice always enters the conversation. Because rice solves problems. A small amount expands into a large meal. It combines with almost anything. Beans, chicken, tuna, vegetables, soup. The possibilities are endless, and that's exactly why people underestimate it. It's so common that they stop noticing how useful it is. Then one day they look at a nearly empty pantry and realize something. The expensive foods disappeared first. The practical foods are the ones they wish they had more of. Rice represents value, not because it's perfect, because it's dependable, and dependable food becomes more attractive the longer you think about it. The second food is oats. Oats have the same problem rice has. They're too ordinary. People walk past them every day. Nobody gets excited about buying oats until they need something filling, something affordable, something that doesn't disappear after one serving. That's where oats shine. A large container can provide breakfast after breakfast after breakfast. And unlike many cereals, oats don't rely on sugar and marketing to create value. They create value because they work. They're filling, flexible, easy to store, easy to use. And the longer people think about food practically, the more attractive oats become. Many people discover this too late. They spend years overlooking them, then suddenly realize one container of oats would have provided more useful meals than several expensive breakfast foods combined. That's when the regret appears. Not because oats are exciting, because they quietly outperform expectations. The third food is dried beans. This is where things get interesting. Because beans don't just provide calories. They provide options. Black beans, kidney beans, pinto beans, lentils, chickpeas. Every variety brings something slightly different, yet they all share one thing: value. Beans consistently rank among the most affordable sources of nutrition available, and because they store well, they remain useful long after many other foods disappear. The challenge is patience. Beans require preparation. People often prefer convenience. That's why they buy more expensive alternatives, then later realize those alternatives vanished quickly. Meanwhile, the beans they ignored would have kept producing meal after meal. This is a recurring theme. Cheap foods often require slightly more planning. Expensive foods often require less, and many people discover that trade-off only after spending much more money than necessary. The fourth food is peanut butter. Few foods combine affordability, convenience, calories, and shelf life as effectively. Open the jar. Eat. Simple. No cooking, no preparation, no refrigeration until opened. Peanut butter is one of those foods that quietly solves problems. Need a quick breakfast? Peanut butter. Need calories? Peanut butter. Need something filling? Peanut butter. Need a shelf-stable food? Peanut butter. That's why people consistently wish they'd bought more. Not because it's fancy. Because it works in situations where many other foods fail. And unlike highly processed snack foods, peanut butter tends to feel substantial. A spoonful actually matters. That's what makes it valuable. The fifth food is pasta. Pasta disappears from shelves for a reason. People understand it. They know how to cook it. They know how to eat it. They know how to combine it with other foods. That familiarity creates demand. A single box doesn't seem important. Then people start calculating meals. And suddenly pasta looks much more useful. That's because pasta isn't one meal. It's many meals. It stretches ingredients, supports sauces, supports proteins, supports vegetables, supports leftovers. That's a lot of flexibility for a relatively inexpensive product. And flexibility is one of the most valuable qualities a food can have. The sixth food is canned tuna. This is where affordability starts meeting practicality. Protein is expensive. Fresh protein especially. Tuna helps solve that. It stores easily, requires no refrigeration before opening, provides protein, creates meals, and remains useful in countless situations. People often buy 1 or 2 cans, then wish they had bought 10. Not because they suddenly became obsessed with tuna, because they finally noticed how often it solves a problem, and that's the pattern you'll keep seeing. The foods people wish they'd bought more of are rarely the foods creating excitement in the store. They're the foods quietly creating value, and the next 6 foods continue that pattern in surprising ways. The 7th food is canned soup. Not every canned soup. The thick ones. The soups that actually feel like meals. The soups with beans, vegetables, meat, pasta, rice. The soups that leave you satisfied instead of looking for something else 20 minutes later. People often underestimate canned soup because it seems ordinary. It sits on shelves year after year, nobody talks about it much. Then one day they open a can, realize it requires almost no effort, and suddenly understand why it has survived for generations. Convenience is valuable, but convenience that also stores well is even more valuable. That's why people constantly underestimate canned soup. A few cans don't look impressive sitting on a shelf. Yet, when cooking becomes inconvenient, those same cans suddenly become some of the most useful foods in the house. The lesson is simple. Don't judge food by how exciting it looks. Judge it by how useful it becomes when life gets complicated. And canned soup consistently passes that test. The 8th food is potatoes. This surprises people, because most discussions focus on packaged foods, yet potatoes remain one of the best values in a grocery store. For generations, people relied heavily on potatoes for one reason: they work. They're filling, affordable, versatile, and surprisingly satisfying. Mashed, baked, roasted, fried, added to soups, added to stews, added to almost anything. Few foods adapt as easily. That's why people often wish they'd paid more attention to them. The funny thing is that potatoes are often viewed as boring, but boring foods built civilizations. Boring foods fed families. Boring foods survived economic downturns, and boring foods continue providing value long after trendy foods disappear from memory. Potatoes aren't impressive, they're dependable. That's what matters. The 9th food is flour. This is where many people suddenly realize how much potential exists inside a simple bag. A bag of flour doesn't look like much, but what it can become is another story entirely. Bread, flatbread, pancakes, biscuits, pizza dough, countless recipes. A single inexpensive ingredient creates dozens of possibilities. That's why flour quietly becomes one of the most valuable items in many kitchens. People often ignore it because they focus on finished products. Ready-made foods, convenient foods, packaged foods. Then later they discover something. Ingredients create flexibility. Finished products create limits. The ability to make food is often more valuable than buying food. And flour sits right at the center of that idea, which is why people frequently wish they'd bought more when it was cheap and easy to find. The 10th food is eggs. Eggs have become more expensive at times, then cheaper again, then expensive again. Yet, they remain one of the most practical foods available. Why? Because they solve so many problems. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, baking, protein. Eggs fit almost anywhere. They're one of the few foods that feel equally comfortable in a simple meal or a complicated one, and because they're so versatile, people often underestimate how much value they provide. Until they don't have them, that's when appreciation appears. People suddenly realize how often eggs help stretch ingredients, fill gaps, complete meals. That's why eggs remain a staple in households around the world, not because they're fashionable, because they're useful. The 11th food is canned tomatoes. This might be one of the most overlooked pantry foods in the entire store. People buy sauces, prepared meals, convenience products, then forget the ingredient that supports countless recipes. Canned tomatoes become soup, sauce, chili, stew, pasta dishes, rice dishes, and dozens of other meals. They're affordable, flexible, and surprisingly powerful when combined with other inexpensive foods. That's why experienced cooks often keep them around, not because they plan specific meals, because they create options, and options become valuable very quickly when budgets become tight. Many people discover this after spending years overlooking them. Then they start cooking more, and suddenly canned tomatoes seem to appear in everything. That's not an accident. It's because they work. The 12th food is popcorn. This is the surprise ending, because most viewers expect another staple, another protein, another pantry item. Instead, let's talk about one of the cheapest snacks available. Popcorn. Not microwave popcorn. Plain popcorn kernels. The reason is simple. They're incredibly affordable. A surprisingly large amount of food comes from a relatively small package. People often spend enormous amounts of money on snacks, chips, crackers, cookies, treats, then overlook one of the cheapest options available. Popcorn doesn't replace meals, but it stretches budgets. And that's important. Because food spending isn't just about meals, it's also about everything in between. The little purchases, the impulse purchases, the comfort purchases. Those add up quickly. Popcorn helps reduce that pressure, and that's why people frequently wish they'd bought more. Not because it's essential, because it's practical. What makes this entire list interesting isn't the foods themselves, it's the pattern. Rice, oats, beans, peanut butter, pasta, tuna, soup, potatoes, flour, eggs, tomatoes, popcorn. None of these foods are exciting, none are trendy, none create huge social media reactions. Yet these are exactly the foods people repeatedly return to. Why? Because value wins. Eventually people stop asking, what's the newest thing? And start asking, what's actually worth buying? That's when these foods start looking different. Not because they changed, because perspective changed. And once people notice that, they often find themselves saying exactly the same thing. I should have bought more of that. Now, let's step back for a moment, because this isn't really a video about rice, or oats, or beans, or peanut butter. It's a video about something much bigger. It's about how people think about food. Most shoppers focus on today's meal, today's craving, today's convenience, and that's completely understandable. Life is busy, people are tired, they want something easy, something quick, something familiar. The problem is that convenience often hides value, and value is what people miss later. That's why so many people look back at their grocery habits and realize they spent years overlooking some of the most useful foods in the entire store. Not because those foods were hidden, not because they were expensive, not because they were difficult to find, because they were ordinary. And ordinary things are easy to ignore, until they're gone. Think about how often people walk past rice. Every week, every month, every year. It's always there. So nobody worries about it. The same thing happens with oats, beans, flour, soup. They're permanent, reliable, predictable. And because they're predictable, people stop appreciating them. Human nature works that way. People notice scarcity. They don't notice abundance. If a shelf is always full, it becomes invisible. If a shelf suddenly empties, everyone notices immediately. That's why some of the cheapest foods in a store become the most desired foods when people start thinking practically. The food didn't change, awareness changed, and that's an important lesson, because awareness affects spending. Many households spend hundreds or even thousands each year on foods that disappear quickly. Single-serving items, convenience products, impulse purchases, tiny upgrades that feel insignificant at the time. A few extra pounds here, a few extra pounds there. Nothing seems dramatic. Then people add everything together, and suddenly they realize how much money quietly disappeared. At the same time, some of the most useful foods in the store remained largely ignored. That's the irony. People often spend the most money on foods, providing the least long-term value, and spend the least money on foods, providing the most value. The next lesson is flexibility. This is where cheap foods really shine. Imagine two cupboards. One is filled with highly specific products, ready meals, specialty snacks, single-purpose foods. The other contains rice, beans, flour, pasta, oats, peanut butter, canned tomatoes. Which cupboard creates more possibilities? The answer isn't even close. The second cupboard wins every time. Because flexibility compounds. Rice works with beans, beans work with tomatoes, tomatoes work with pasta, flour works with dozens of recipes. Everything connects, everything supports something else. That's what makes pantry foods powerful. They're not individual products, they're building blocks, and building blocks create options. People don't usually appreciate options until they need them. Then suddenly, options become everything. That's one reason experienced shoppers often think differently. They're not asking, "What can I eat today?" They're asking, "What can this become?" That's a completely different question, and it leads to completely different purchases. Another lesson hidden inside this list is shelf life. People rarely think about shelf life when stores are full. Why would they? Food seems endless. The next shopping trip is only a few days away. Then reality changes, and suddenly shelf life becomes important. Foods that store well create flexibility. Foods that disappear quickly create pressure. Pressure changes behavior. People rush, overspend, make emotional decisions. Flexibility does the opposite. Flexibility creates patience, and patience saves money. This is why some of the cheapest foods continue appearing in pantries generation after generation. Not because people lack choices, because these foods solve problems. Grandparents bought them, parents bought them, and despite all the changes in modern grocery stores, many of them still provide incredible value today. That's not an accident, it's a sign that usefulness survives trends. Trends come and go, useful foods remain. Now let's talk about one of the biggest mistakes people make. They assume expensive automatically means better. Sometimes it does, often it doesn't. Price and value are not the same thing. A product can be expensive and provide very little value. A product can be inexpensive and provide enormous value. That's exactly what this list demonstrates. Rice isn't expensive, yet it feeds millions. Beans aren't expensive, yet they remain one of the most practical foods available. Oats aren't expensive, yet they continue appearing in discussions about nutrition, budgeting, and food security. The pattern repeats over and over. Cheap doesn't automatically mean low quality. Cheap often means overlooked, and overlooked opportunities are everywhere in grocery stores. The final lesson is probably the most important. People regret buying the wrong things, but they also regret not buying the right things. That's what connects every food on this list. Not perfection, not survival, not extreme preparedness. Regret. The moment someone realizes, "I wish I'd bought more of that." That moment happens because value became visible. Sometimes it becomes visible during a tight budget. Sometimes during rising prices. Sometimes during a disruption. Sometimes during a simple trip to the pantry. The situation changes. The realization stays the same. And once people experience that realization, they rarely look at these foods the same way again. Rice stops being boring. Beans stop being boring. Oats stop being boring. Because usefulness changes perception. The more useful something becomes, the more valuable it feels. That's why these foods continue showing up year after year. Not because they're exciting, because they work. And when you strip away advertising, trends, packaging, and hype, that's what people are really looking for. Foods that work. Foods that stretch budgets. Foods that create meals. Foods that solve problems. Foods that keep delivering value long after the receipt has been thrown away. That's why these 12 foods matter, and that's why so many people eventually find themselves saying the same thing. Not, "I wish I'd bought something more expensive." Not, "I wish I'd bought something trendier," but, "I wish I'd bought more of that."